Hi, Julie Jones from SSB Performance, Smarter, Stronger, Better Mindset Training. Here with this week's Mindset Made Simple Tip of the Week, brought to you by Game Day Sportswear. This week we're talking about contagious culture and what your team catches and what matters most. Now, I've been thinking about this a lot because the portal and people going to different places. I had a kid that worked with me call last year in May and say, hey, should I go in the portal? I'm like, why? I mean, why would you want to do that? She played every game. She was having a good experience. She said, because 4 or 5 people on the team are going and I want to make sure I'm not missing my opportunity. Well, she decided to stay. But this year she called, same thing in May, and said, hey, I think I'm going to go in the portal. What do you think? So we had a conversation about it. It turned out really well for her. She got a bigger school, more money, better opportunity. But the truth of it is now she has to start over. And her coach and so many other coaches, and the coaching staff that she left, are starting over in so many ways as well. So when we think about the transient nature of sport or the transient nature of business in today's world, where people stay 2 or 3 years and go, or a year and a half and go, and it used to be you stayed someplace for 30 years, things are different. And deciding what we want people to catch in our culture becomes even more important. And it starts with a ripple. It starts with a ripple. What we want people to catch starts with a ripple, because everything we do influences the people around us. So when we are building a new roster or building a new program or whatever it might be, it's so important from the beginning for us to decide what we want people to catch when they walk in the door. As John O'Sullivan from the Way of Champions podcast says, your influence is never neutral. We're always influencing something one way or another, and it's our job as leaders to sort of put this front and center, even though we're running all over the place trying to figure out how we're going to rebuild or replace or whatever it might be. Thinking about what we want caught makes a huge difference. In the journal Emotions, Dr. Peggy Marshall talks about emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is real. I don't know if you'll remember in the past, I talked about this study that they did where they had people come in and smell the sweat of skydivers, first-time skydivers. And the people that smelled the sweat of these anxious and excited or whatever, stressed out skydivers actually caught stress. They had a visceral stress response compared to the people that just smelled sweat pads, sounds so disgusting, of people who were just running on a treadmill who were not stressed. So we know that emotions are contagious, whether it's standing next to someone or getting the feel when you walk into a room. Whatever the leader projects, whether it's urgency or calm or whatever it might be, obviously really ripples through. And our emotional tone can either be the anchor or the amplifier or both. And we really want it to be both. We want to be driving the situation. Someone told me a long time ago, if you don't keep your eye on your culture, somebody else will. And boy, is that true. We need to make sure that we are setting the tone regardless of who's coming in and who's different and who's new, because they're looking to us to figure out what's acceptable. Sigal Barsade, I think that's how you say it. I didn't even look. I know she's passed away, unfortunately. Says that emotional contagion influences team cohesion, performance, and effort. And we need to realize that what people catch from us and the new people, the old people, whatever it might be, makes a difference. So if stress is contagious, like in the study, so is joy, so is focus, so is belief, so is connection. And we've got to figure out how to make these things what we want. I read just recently in Called to Greatness by Alex Auerbach that coaches spend a lot of time wishing for a team that they had instead of coaching the one that they have now. And I think that probably happens a lot when you pour into this kid and then they leave and now you've got to figure out how to replace it. But even so, we can figure out how to spark contagious behavior. And one way to do that is to emphasize connection, physical connection. A study was published and it found that NBA teams that had more touches, whatever, touch on the shoulder, touch on the butt, touch on whatever, those teams won more games. And it makes sense because physical connection synchronizes emotion and builds social bond. And for teams that just come together, this physical touch breeds familiarity. It breeds sort of family. And, of course, obviously, appropriate touch is what we're talking about. But being more connected, even physically, makes a difference. At one point in my career at Cleveland State, we had a rule that if you saw your teammates around campus, wherever they were, you had to give them a high five. Why is that important? Well, you're acknowledging their existence. Even if you're pissed off or whatever, you don't feel like it, you're having a day, you are making a connection. And when we connect, we feel better. Relationships, above all else, indicate longer life, period. And when we connect, we feel better. We create that intentional touch. What can we do in our team from the very beginning to create that connection physically? That's something to think about. But cohesion doesn't just come from matching jerseys and high fives, right? Research also shows, and there's bugs all over the place here, that storytelling, especially outside of competition, boosts connection. So I don't know if I really would have been into this as a coach, but when kids come in from a different program, finding out their story is really important. We always sort of ignored what they had done in the past, not wanting to bring that up or dredge it up or talk about it. But the truth of it is, figuring out where they came from, what they're looking for, where they want to go can help, and then figure out how that bridges with the kids that are there. And maybe they'll find that they're, more welcomed in that way from both sides. Because no doubt that when you bring a new kid in, someone on your roster is feeling threatened. And when they feel threatened, things change. So hopefully storytelling a little bit can bring us together, and then we can dive into individual values and shared values. I read just recently that Ben Franklin, with his 13 virtues, 13 might be a lot, but setting and measuring our values and seeing how we're living up to them. So we know who we think we are, but what are we doing that shows that? So he had a practice where he would choose one of his 13 virtues every month, and he had a little tiny book, and all he would do is write the virtue at the top of the month, and he would have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, on through. And if he did not live his value that day, he made a check in his little notebook. No notes, no nothing. The goal was, by the end of the year, to have fewer and fewer and fewer checks, because he was checking if he didn't do it. So the fewer the checks, the better he was living toward his values. And I thought, gosh, this would be a great way to help our team decide whether we are connected to our values, if our behaviors are modeling them. Because if they're not, then there's going to be dissonance, there's going to be frustration, there's going to be all kinds of things. And if we can check on that either every day or every week, whatever you think, you have maybe 2 or 3 that you go through, say, did we live, do our behaviors measure this? It sort of goes back to staying connected to our why. So then we're asking about our what and trying to figure out if what we're doing fits our why. And if it doesn't, then why are we doing what we're doing is really the question. So a few of these things, the touch, storytelling, sticking to our values and measuring them against our behaviors, can help us build or maintain the contagion that we're looking for, because we're setting the tone. We can post slogans, we can talk about standards, we can do all these things, but we know that culture is absorbed, it's felt, it's how we do things around here. And we've got to lead that every year now, because the roster changes. We've got to get kids to realize, hey, you're here this year, this is what we're doing this year, this is how we're going to be successful this year. Whatever happens after that, it is what it is. So this emotional contagion idea, what we want people to catch, can be very, very helpful. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we want them to catch from us? What do we want them to catch from each other? And am I sharing my values and staying connected to them? Things change, people change, but standards don't have to change. We've got to show them and get them to feel what we want them to feel. So it's up to us to make sure that they're catching the right thing. It's up to us to make our culture the most contagious thing in the room. Change is hard. Changing rosters is hard. Getting a new team every year is hard. Teaching new stuff every year is hard. But before you teach anything, and I wish I would have done this when I first got to Akron, I gave them what I knew, not what I wanted them to be or who I was. And if I had to go back and start it all over again, I would start with, these are my values. This is what I want you to catch. Then we'll teach you first and thirds and how to steal bases and all those kinds of things. So it's up to you to figure out what you want them to catch. But these three things, connection, physical touch, storytelling, and then tying that to values and keeping that with our why and making sure that those things match our behaviors, those things can go a long way. If you'd like to talk about any of these things or talk more about mental performance for your team, reach out, juliej@ssbperformance.com. I'd love to connect. Until next week, have a great week.